In 1980, 4 village nuns disappeared without a trace in the dense forests of Northern California, leaving a grieving community and a priest haunted by the mystery of their fate. 28 years later, on the anniversary of their vanishing, a single clue emerges, a faint echo from beneath the earth that would lead Father Elias on a harrowing journey to confront the darkness that had consumed his sister and uncover a truth more shocking than he could ever have imagined. What happened in those silent woods? And how did one woman keep her faith alive in the most unthinkable of prisons? Stay with us as we reveal the heart-pounding true story of survival, faith, and the power of hope that never dies. The morning sun had just begun to pierce through the thin veil of fog that clung to the edges of Eldon Hollow, a small village in the rolling green hills of Northern California. The light that managed to slip through the ancient oaks and pines seemed almost hesitant, reluctant to disturb the heavy silence that had settled over St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church. In the muted glow of dawn, the stained glass windows glowed faintly, each pane a kaleidoscope of color that shifted and danced with the slow movement of the clouds. Inside, the air was cool and scented faintly with old incense and polished wood, the scent of prayers whispered and tears shed over decades. The pews, worn smooth by generations of faithful parishioners, waited patiently for the congregation to arrive for the memorial mass, a ritual that had become as much a part of the community's rhythm as the changing seasons. Father Elias Maro stood at the altar, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the wooden crucifix that loomed above him. His hands, aged but steady, gripped the edges of the pulpit as he prepared to lead the service that had become an annual testament to both faith and lingering sorrow. His cassock, black as the night that had swallowed his sister and her companion so many years ago, rustled softly as he moved. In the flickering candlelight, the silver threads at his temples caught the light, a mark of the years that had passed, etched into his hair like lines of a lament. He paused, drawing in a breath that tasted of beeswax and thyme, and let his gaze travel over the flickering candles that lined the altar, each flame a fragile promise of remembrance. As the last of the worshippers filed into the pews, a hush fell over the sanctuary, a silence so profound it seemed to echo with the weight of the years. Faces turned toward him, some etched with the deep lines of age, others still smooth with the innocence of youth, all of them marked by the same quiet anticipation. These were the people who had come to remember, to mourn, and, perhaps, to find a measure of peace in the liturgy that would follow. He knew their stories as intimately as he knew the lines of his own face. The families who had lived through the mystery, the children who had grown up in its shadow, the elders who could still recall the sound of the nuns' laughter as they tended the flower beds behind the chapel. "May the souls of the departed," he began, his voice low and resonant, each word measured and deliberate, "through the mercy of God, rest in peace." His fingers traced the sign of the cross, the familiar gesture both comfort and command. From the pews came the soft murmur of Amen, a word that hung in the air like a benediction, binding them all together in this shared act of remembrance. As he looked out over the assembled congregation, his eyes paused on the familiar faces. Mrs. Harmon, her hair white as snow, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She clutched a worn prayer book to her chest, her knuckles pale against the faded leather. He remembered how, in her younger years, she had sung in the choir with a voice that could move even the most hardened heart to tears. Now, that voice was silent, but the music of her faith still echoed in the quiet devotion of her presence. Father Elias's gaze shifted to the children seated beside their parents, their faces solemn and wide-eyed, absorbing the weight of the moment without truly understanding it. For them, the 4 vanished nuns were little more than names spoken in hushed reverence, faces in faded photographs that hung in the vestibule. Yet, even in their innocence, they carried a piece of the mystery that had haunted Eldon Hollow for 28 long years. It was a mystery that had woven itself into the very fabric of the village, a thread of darkness running through every whispered conversation, every anxious glance toward the forest that loomed beyond the churchyard. As the final notes of the opening hymn faded into the stillness, Father Elias stepped down from the pulpit and moved to the front of the sanctuary. His steps were measured, deliberate, as though each one was a pilgrimage, a journey back to the day that had changed everything. He paused before the small table that held the framed photographs of the 4 missing women. Sister Mildred Hayes, her face lined with the gentle wisdom of her 68 years, her eyes kind beneath the soft folds of her veil. Sister Joan Keller, whose quiet laughter had once filled the halls of the convent, her hands always busy with small acts of kindness. Sister Beatrice Namora, so young, only 28, her smile shy but luminous in the single photograph they had of her. And his own sister, Sister Elias Maro, just 23, her eyes alight with the fire of her faith, her smile a promise of hope. His fingers hovered over the glass, tracing the contours of their faces as though he could reach through the years and bring them back. "We remember them," he murmured, the words barely more than a breath. Not just for who they were, but for what they gave, for the lives they touched, and for the faith that sustained them even in the face of darkness. He closed his eyes, drawing in the scent of lilies that filled the air, their white petals a symbol of purity and resurrection. In his mind, he heard the echo of his sister's laughter, saw the light in her eyes as she spoke of her calling, her dreams of serving God with every breath. That memory was both a balm and a blade, comforting in its warmth, yet cutting deep with the knowledge of all that had been lost. The Mass continued, the familiar rituals a soothing cadence that wrapped around the grief like a comforting shawl. The readings spoke of faith and endurance, of the promise of redemption, even in the shadow of despair. As he lifted the chalice, the gold catching the light in a brief, brilliant flare, Father Elias felt a tremor run through him. For a moment, the weight of the years threatened to buckle his knees, to drag him down into the abyss of memory. But he steadied himself, drawing strength from the prayers that rose like incense around him, from the steadfast faces that looked to him for solace. This was his duty, his calling, to stand as a bridge between the living and the lost, to offer what comfort he could in the face of the unknowable. When the final blessing had been spoken and the congregation began to rise from their pews, Father Elias moved to the back of the church. He stood by the heavy oak doors, greeting each parishioner as they filed past, his hands warm and steady as they clasped those of the elderly, the young, the grieving. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," he said softly, his voice threaded with genuine gratitude. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I always come, Father," she said, her voice trembling. "I still remember how Sister Mildred taught my children their catechism. Such a gentle soul." Father Elias nodded, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "She was a light in this world," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his sorrow. "We must trust that she is with God now, and at peace." As the last of the congregation departed, the heavy doors swung closed behind them, with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the empty sanctuary. Father Elias stood for a moment in the silence, the faint scent of lilies and candle wax lingering in the air. He let his eyes wander over the flickering candles that still burned on the altar, each flame a fragile sentinel against the darkness that had claimed the four women so long ago. He turned, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as he made his way back to his office at the rear of the church. The small room was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, each one a testament to the faith that had shaped his life. A single window looked out over the churchyard, where the headstones of generations of parishioners stood in silent vigil beneath the towering pines. He sank into the worn leather chair behind his desk, the weight of the years settling around his shoulders like a mantle. For a moment, he simply sat, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed as he let the silence wash over him. It was in these moments, alone and unguarded, that the questions he never voiced to his parishioners rose up to haunt him. "Why, Lord?" he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of the years. "Why did you allow them to be taken? Why did you let my sister, your servant, vanish without a trace?" He pressed his fingers to his temples, the weight of the questions pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He reached for the small wooden box he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, his fingers trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside, the photographs he had preserved with such care lay like fragile relics of a world that had slipped through his fingers. He picked up the picture of Sister Terz, taken on the day she took her final vows. Her face was alight with joy, her eyes shining with the conviction that had always burned so bright in her soul. "I was so proud of you," he murmured, his voice a thread of sound in the quiet room. "I still am." He traced her smile with his fingertip, the memory of that day as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She had looked so young, so certain, her hands folded in prayer as she pledged her life to a God she believed would never abandon her. The thought that had haunted him for 28 years crept back into his mind, a serpent's whisper that coiled around his heart. If I hadn't encouraged her vocation, he thought, the words bitter as bile, would she still be here today? Would she be alive, a teacher, a mother, instead of... He cut off the thought with a sharp intake of breath, crossing himself to banish the treacherous doubt. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, he said aloud, his voice steadying with the familiar cadence. I will not question your plan, Lord, even in my darkest hour. He set the photograph aside and reached for the last known image of the 4 missing nuns, taken just days before they vanished. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench outside the small chapel of St. Diana, the forest rising like a dark wall behind them. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, their faces serene and wise. Sister Beatrice, her posture relaxed but her eyes filled with reverence. And Terz, the youngest, her eyes bright with the light of purpose that had guided her every step. Father Elias studied the photograph, his mind drifting to the memories of that time, the frantic days of searching, the endless hours of prayer and pleading, the empty nights filled with dreams of finding them safe and whole. He remembered the search parties that had combed the forest, the scent of pine and damp earth heavy in the air as they pushed through the underbrush, calling out the names of the missing. He remembered the police, their faces drawn with exhaustion and frustration, their words of comfort falling hollow in the face of the complete and utter absence of clues. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into the ether, leaving nothing behind but the echoes of their prayers and the grief of those who had loved them. The silence of Father Elias's office was broken only by the soft ticking of the ancient clock on the wall, each second a slow, measured heartbeat in the quiet room. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers still resting on the photograph of the 4 women. The weight of memory pressed down on him, but there was also a strange undercurrent, an almost electric charge that thrummed through the air, tugging at the edges of his thoughts. He closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him, the faintest stirring of something he couldn't quite name. A pull, a whisper in the depths of his soul that had begun to rise up more insistently with each passing year. It was the same pull that had brought him here today, to the 28th anniversary of the day his sister vanished, to this moment of quiet desperation and flickering hope. He set the photograph back in the box and closed the lid gently, almost reverently. Rising from his chair, he moved to the window, staring out at the quiet churchyard beyond. The gravestones stood in ordered rows, weathered by time and the elements, each one a silent testament to the lives that had passed through this world. His gaze drifted to the line of pines that bordered the cemetery, their dark boughs whispering in the early morning breeze. Beyond them lay the Shasta Trinity National Forest, a place of beauty and mystery, a place that had swallowed 4 women whole and left nothing behind. Father Elias drew in a deep breath and turned away from the window, his decision made. He would not let this anniversary pass in passive remembrance. Something inside him, some deep, unshakable part of his faith, told him that there was more to be discovered, that the answers he had sought for 28 years might finally be within reach. Moving with a quiet purpose, he gathered his Bible and rosary, slipping them into the worn leather satchel that had accompanied him on countless pastoral visits. He took one last look around the office, his eyes lingering on the crucifix above the door, then stepped out into the hushed corridors of the church. The morning light had grown stronger now, washing the stained glass in vibrant color as he walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor. At the main doors, he paused, his hand resting on the cool wood as he whispered a prayer. Lord, guide me. If I am meant to find the truth today, let me be your servant in this search. The words were a balm against the uncertainty that twisted in his chest, a final shield of faith as he stepped out into the waiting day. The drive from Eldon Hollow to the forest took just over an hour, the narrow road winding through farmland and forest, past weathered barns and the slow-moving currents of the river that cut through the valley. With each mile, the landscape grew wilder, the neat rows of crops giving way to the dense, tangled majesty of the pines and cedars. Father Elias drove with a steady hand, his mind a quiet storm of memory and prayer. He thought of the times he had made this same journey in the weeks after the disappearance, his car filled with missing person flyers and the raw, desperate hope that had burned in his heart like a fever. Those early days had been a blur of search parties and interviews, of questions that had no answers and nights spent staring into the darkness, trying to hear his sister's voice in the rustle of the leaves. Now, the years had dulled the sharp edge of that hope, but it had not extinguished it entirely. He felt it flickering in his chest as he turned onto the narrow forest road that would lead him to St. Dina's, what remained of it. When he reached the place where he remembered the old chapel once standing, Father Elias pulled his car to the side of the road and sat for a moment, staring out at the landscape that had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The dirt path that had once led to the chapel was gone, replaced by a paved private road that curved away into the forest, guarded by an ornate iron gate. Signs warned trespassers to keep out, their stark letters a cold barrier between him and the ground that had once been holy. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet as he approached the gate. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, tracing the intricate scrollwork that had been crafted with such care. Beyond the bars, he could see the road winding away into a landscape that had been tamed and shaped to fit the tastes of its new owner. The chapel itself was gone, its white walls and modest bell tower replaced by manicured gardens and ornamental trees that seemed to mock the memory of what had once stood here. Father Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the ache in his chest settle into something more resolute. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, the image of the 4 nuns sitting in the sunlight outside St. Dina's. The chapel rose behind them in the picture, a simple structure of weathered wood and whitewashed walls, a place of peace and quiet devotion. Seeing it now, lost to the world except in this single captured moment, he felt the weight of its absence as a physical thing. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Harold Gibbons, the caretaker who had once watched over St. Dina's with the same quiet devotion that Father Elias had given to his parish. The line rang several times before Harold's gruff voice answered, carrying a note of surprise. "Father Elias? It's been years since I last heard your voice." "Harold," Father Elias said, his voice warm with gratitude. "I'm at the site of St. Dina's, but it's gone, Harold. I knew it had been decommissioned, but I didn't realize how thoroughly it had been erased." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the faint rustle of static like the soft breathing of the forest itself. "Aye," Harold said finally, his voice heavy. "Silas Redwood bought the land in '82, tore the chapel down right quick, said he had no use for old ghosts." Father Elias felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the day. "Old ghosts," he murmured. "And yet, they're still here, aren't they?" "Aye," Harold agreed, his voice softening. "You know, Father, I still have a few things from the chapel. The altar cross, some of the old prayer books. I couldn't bear to see them thrown out like so much rubbish." "I would like to see them," Father Elias said quietly. "But first, I feel I need to walk the land again, to stand where my sister once stood." "Be careful, Father," Harold warned. "Silas Redwood. He doesn't take kindly to visitors, even ones with good intentions." "I understand," Father Elias replied, his tone resolute. "But this is something I must do." Ending the call, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and stepped away from the gate, his gaze sweeping the forest that pressed in close around the property. He began to walk along the perimeter, the fence cold and unyielding beneath his hand. The land sloped gently upward, the rise of earth and stone pushing the fence higher in places, dipping lower in others. He remembered the layout of the chapel grounds as they had once been, the simple wooden bench where the nuns had sat, the gnarled oak that had offered them shade. That oak was gone now, cut down to make way for the carefully tended gardens that sprawled in its place. But the memory of it was as vivid as the smell of the pine needles crushed beneath his feet. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the gentle murmur of prayers, the rustle of habits in the soft summer breeze. When he opened them again, he found himself at a section of fence where the ground had shifted over the years, leaving the posts crooked and the metal sagging. He paused, his hand resting on the cold iron as he felt the faintest breath of air from the forest beyond. And there, in that quiet moment, he heard it. A sound so soft he thought at first it must be the sigh of the wind through the trees. But it was not the wind. It was music, faint and distant, the low, haunting cadence of a Gregorian chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. His breath caught in his throat, his heart thundering in his chest as he leaned closer, straining to hear. The sound faded, swallowed by the hush of the forest, but the echo of it lingered in his mind like the memory of a dream. He pressed his fingers against the fence, feeling the rough bite of rust against his skin, and whispered a prayer for courage. Without fully understanding why, he began to move again, following the fence until he reached a place where the ground rose sharply, pushing the iron higher until it loomed above him like a wall. He paused, his eyes tracing the rough stone that jutted from the earth, a natural fortress that had stood long before the first stone of St. Dina's was laid. And in that moment, he felt something shift within him, a certainty as clear as the ringing of a bell in the quiet dawn. He had to go on, to see this mystery through to its end, no matter where it might lead. With a deep breath, Father Elias turned and retraced his steps to his car. He drove slowly back to the main road, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. But beneath the uncertainty was a thread of resolve, stronger than the fear that coiled in his belly. He would find the truth, for his sister, and for the souls of the other women who had vanished. He would find it, even if it meant stepping into the darkness that waited beyond the edge of the world he had known. The forest loomed ahead of him, ancient and watchful, and as he turned the car back toward the village to speak with Harold, he felt the weight of the years settle more firmly on his shoulders. The truth was waiting for him, just beyond the edge of memory, and he would not rest until he brought it into the light. The winding road back to Eldon Hollow unfurled beneath Father Elias's tires like a faded ribbon, the dark pines crowding closer as he drove. Each mile felt like a descent deeper into memory, a journey backward to the days when he had first come here, the raw shock of his sister's disappearance still bright and searing in his mind. Back then, he had been a young priest, his faith a burning torch that he held high against the darkness. Now, decades later, he carried that same light, but it flickered in a different way, tempered by years of searching and loss. When he reached Harold Gibbon's cabin, the sun had begun to slide down the sky, the forest's long shadows creeping across the narrow dirt driveway. The old caretaker was waiting outside, leaning against the porch rail with an air of quiet patience. As Father Elias stepped out of the car, Harold straightened, his weathered face creasing into a somber smile. "You found something out there, didn't you, Father?" he asked softly. "I saw it in your eyes, even before you left." Father Elias nodded, his fingers tightening on the strap of his satchel. "I heard music, Harold, not just in my mind. Real music, Gregorian chant, coming from somewhere near the old chapel site." Harold's bushy brows knit together, a flicker of unease passing across his face. "That's not something you hear every day," he said. "But I've always believed that land holds echoes, even when the buildings are gone. Maybe you heard the sisters' prayers carried on the wind." Father Elias shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "It wasn't just an echo. There was something there, something alive. I need to see what you've kept from the chapel, Harold. Maybe there's something that will help me understand." The caretaker nodded and motioned for Father Elias to follow him inside. The cabin was small and simply furnished, its walls lined with shelves of battered books and old photographs. A crucifix hung above the fireplace, its wood darkened with age, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Harold led him to a small spare room at the back of the cabin. There, in a battered trunk with brass fittings, he had stored what he had managed to salvage when St. Dina's was torn down. Father Elias knelt beside it, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded linen, lay the altar cross, a simple thing of dark wood and tarnished brass, worn smooth by decades of hands that had lifted it in prayer. He lifted it gently, feeling the weight of its history settle into his palms. It was a relic of the sacred, a reminder that even in the face of violence and desecration, something holy could endure. Beside the cross were several prayer books, their pages yellowed and fragile, the words of psalms and hymns, a testament to the faith that had once filled the small chapel. He opened one at random, his eyes tracing the familiar verses, and felt a pang of sorrow for the voices that had once lifted those words in song. At the bottom of the trunk lay a small wooden box, its lid carved with a simple cross. Father Elias hesitated for a moment, then opened it to reveal a collection of rosary beads, each one lovingly strung and worn smooth by years of use. As he held the beads in his hands, a memory rose unbidden, his sister's voice, soft and sure, reciting the prayers that had comforted them both in childhood. He closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him, a bittersweet balm against the ache in his chest. "Thank you, Harold," he said quietly. "These things, they're not just relics. They're a part of her, of all of them. I think they'll help me find what I'm searching for." Harold's eyes were kind, but there was a shadow in them too, a flicker of worry that mirrored the unease growing in Father Elias's own heart. "Be careful, Father," he said. "That land, it's not just the trees and the stones, it's something deeper, something that doesn't always welcome those who come asking questions." Father Elias nodded, his expression resolute. "I know, but I have to go back, Harold. I have to find out what happened to them, to my sister. It's the only way I'll ever find peace." He packed the items carefully back into the trunk, then rose and turned to leave. The light outside had grown soft and golden, the hush of evening settling over the forest. As he stepped back into the fading day, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him, a certainty that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the strength of his faith. The road back to the chapel site felt both familiar and strange as he drove, the trees arching overhead like a cathedral of green. Each turn of the winding road was a prayer, each mile a litany of memory and hope. When he reached the place where the old dirt path had once led to the chapel, he stopped his car and stepped out. The sun was low in the sky now, painting the world in hues of gold and crimson, and the forest was alive with the quiet sounds of evening. He walked slowly toward the fence, the photograph of the 4 nuns in his pocket like a talisman against the growing darkness. As he neared the spot where he had heard the music, he paused, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the gathering dusk, he saw something he had missed before, a faint line of disturbed earth, a seam in the manicured landscape that spoke of something hidden beneath. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of the seam, and felt the faintest tremor of air, as if the earth itself was breathing. A shiver ran down his spine, but he did not turn away. Instead, he pressed his hand flat against the ground, his voice a whisper of prayer. "Lord, grant me courage. Lead me to the truth." The air grew colder as the sun slipped below the horizon, the forest shadows lengthening into darkness. But Father Elias felt no fear. He rose slowly, his hand still pressed to the earth, and whispered one final promise to the memory of his sister. "I will not leave you in the darkness. I will bring you home." As he turned back toward his car, the first stars began to flicker in the darkening sky, their cold light a promise of the clarity that lay just beyond the veil of night. In that quiet, starlit moment, Father Elias felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. The truth was out there, waiting for him like a distant star, and he would follow it no matter how long the journey or how dark the path. Father Elias's footsteps were quiet on the forest floor as he retraced the path to the chapel site under the cover of night. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered like ghosts of the past. He carried with him the relics from Harold's trunk, a small wooden cross, and the faded photograph of the 4 missing nuns, his sister's bright eyes shining with purpose, even in the grainy image. Each step was a prayer, a litany of faith and doubt woven together as he pressed deeper into the darkness. When he reached the fence line, the broken section he had stumbled through earlier still gaped open, a silent invitation to trespass. Father Elias hesitated for only a moment, then stepped through, the metal cold against his hand as he steadied himself. Beyond the fence, the landscaped grounds stretched out in careful symmetry, ornamental shrubs and manicured lawns that seemed to mock the wildness of the forest just beyond. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and Father Elias could almost believe that the world itself was holding its breath. He moved carefully, his senses straining for any sign of movement. The memory of the music he had heard still echoed in his mind, each note a thread pulling him deeper into the mystery. As he approached the spot where the air vent was hidden, he paused, his breath catching in his throat. The metal grate glimmered in the moonlight, rusted and ancient, a secret window into the earth below. Kneeling, he pressed his ear close, straining to catch any sound that might rise from the darkness beneath. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint he might have thought it a trick of the wind, he heard it, a low hum, the same haunting melody that had drifted through his car radio. The notes were slow, deliberate, each one imbued with a sorrow that cut straight to his heart. Father Elias closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. He whispered a prayer, his voice a ragged murmur that wove itself into the music, a plea for mercy, for truth, for the souls lost in the darkness. He rose slowly, his resolve hardening with each breath. The police had promised to return, but he could not wait. Something deep within him, a force beyond fear, beyond reason, compelled him to act. He remembered the photograph in his pocket, the faces of the women who had given their lives to God, and he knew he could not turn away. His sister's eyes, bright with faith and purpose, were a light in the darkness, guiding him forward. The path to Silas Redwood's house was a winding trail of shadows and silence. Father Elias moved with quiet determination, his clerical collar a stark white against the black of his coat. When he reached the imposing structure, he paused at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The house loomed above him, its dark windows reflecting the moonlight like cold, watchful eyes. He could see no sign of Redwood, no flicker of movement behind the glass, and for a moment he wondered if the man was even there. Steeling himself, he approached the front door and knocked softly, his knuckles rapping against the heavy oak with a steady rhythm. The sounds seemed to echo in the stillness, each beat a challenge to the silence that had settled over the house. There was no answer. Father Elias waited, listening to the quiet, then knocked again, louder this time, his breath fogging in the cool night air. When the door finally swung open, it was not Redwood who stood before him, but a housekeeper, an older woman with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Can I help you, Father?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Father Elias bowed his head slightly in greeting. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said softly. "I need to speak with Mr. Redwood. It's a matter of grave importance." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking past him toward the darkened grounds beyond. "Mr. Redwood doesn't like visitors at this hour," she said. "Please, it's urgent," Father Elias insisted, his voice firm but kind. "I believe there are people in danger on this property, souls who have been lost for far too long." The housekeeper studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the depths of the house. Father Elias waited on the threshold, the cool night air seeping into his bones. He whispered a prayer for strength, his fingers absently tracing the beads of the rosary in his pocket. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until at last the housekeeper returned. "He'll see you," she said quietly. "But be careful, Father. There are things in this house, things best left alone." He followed her through the dimly lit hallways, the silence of the house oppressive in its weight. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling and heavy drapes, the air thick with the scent of old books and something else, something metallic and sharp that he could not quite place. They stopped outside a heavy door at the end of the hall, and the housekeeper knocked once before pushing it open. Silas Redwood stood at the far end of the room, his back to the door, as he stared out a tall window into the darkness beyond. The room was a study, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books and strange artifacts that gleamed in the low light. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting long shadows across Redwood's angular features as he turned to face the priest. "So the wandering shepherd returns," Redwood said softly, his voice dripping with cold amusement. "What brings you to my door this time, Father? Another sermon? Another plea for the souls of the lost?" Father Elias met his gaze steadily, his own voice calm but unwavering. "I heard music, Silas. Music coming from beneath your land. I believe someone is down there, someone who has been lost for a very long time." Redwood's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Music? You priests see visions in every shadow, hear angels in the rustling leaves. There's nothing beneath this house but earth and stone." Father Elias shook his head, his eyes bright with conviction. "I know what I heard, Silas, and I know what you've tried to hide. The police will return with a warrant, but I came here tonight as a man of God. I came to ask you, to beg you, to let them go." For a long moment, Redwood said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed once more into the darkness beyond the window. "You waste your prayers on shadows, Father," he said softly. "But if it gives you peace, look where you will. You won't find what you seek." Father Elias felt the weight of Redwood's words pressing against his heart, but he refused to yield. "The truth is not yours to keep," he said quietly. "It belongs to God, and to those who have suffered in its absence." Redwood turned back to him, his eyes cold and hard as polished stone. "Then seek your truth," he said, "but know this. The darkness you chase may swallow you whole." As he left the house, Father Elias felt the chill of Redwood's final words settle over him like a shroud. But he did not turn back. He returned to the place where the music had first called to him, the photograph of his sister, a beacon in the darkness. The stars above shone cold and distant, but in their light he saw a promise, that even in the depths of night, the truth would find its way to the surface. Father Elias returned to the clearing, where the air vent lay hidden beneath the ornamental shrubs. The moon had climbed higher in the sky, silver light pooling around him like a blessing or a warning. The night was still, yet the forest seemed to pulse with a silent energy, as if the very trees leaned closer to witness what he would find. He knelt by the vent, his breath fogging in the chill air, and pressed his ear close once more. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice humming a sacred melody, each note a fragile thread of hope woven into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as he closed his eyes, the memory of his sister's voice merging with the music below. It was as if the very earth was whispering her name. "Teresa," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I'm here." He rose, determination hardening his resolve like tempered steel. If Redwood would not grant him entry, he would find another way. Moving along the fence line, he sought any sign of weakness, his fingers tracing the cold metal in search of a hidden path. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something older, deeper, that set his nerves alight. At last, he found it, a section of the fence where the posts were loose in the rocky soil, shifted over decades of storms and neglect. With careful, deliberate movements, he eased the metal aside, creating a gap just wide enough to slip through. The world beyond the fence felt different, charged with a strange electricity that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He moved cautiously, every footstep a prayer, every breath a plea for guidance. The ornamental landscaping seemed to close around him, the carefully tended plants concealing secrets that had lain buried for far too long. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the ground where the chapel had once stood. In the moonlight, the space looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but he could feel the truth pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Drawing a deep breath, Father Elias approached the air vent once more. He knelt and reached out, his fingers tracing the rusted metal bars. He whispered a prayer, the words of the Psalms tumbling from his lips as he worked to pry the grate loose. The metal groaned in protest, but at last it gave way, the ancient screws snapping under the pressure of his faith-fueled determination. Beneath the grate, a narrow shaft descended into darkness. The air that rose from it was cool and damp, tinged with the scent of earth and something else, something human. He drew back for a moment, his breath catching in his throat, then reached for the small flashlight he had carried with him. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a rough stone passage that twisted out of sight beneath the ground. "Lord, guide me," he whispered, his voice steady even as his hands trembled. "If this is the path you have set before me, I will walk it." He lowered himself into the shaft, the stone walls pressing close around him as he descended. The air grew colder with each step, the silence deepening until it pressed against his ears like a physical weight. He could feel the centuries of the earth closing around him, the darkness wrapping him in its cold embrace. At the bottom of the shaft, the passage widened into a tunnel supported by rough-hewn beams. The floor was hard-packed earth, the walls lined with stones that gleamed dully in the light of his flashlight. He paused, listening to the stillness, and once more he heard it, the faint echo of the hymn, the notes weaving through the silence like a fragile promise. He moved forward, his steps careful and measured, the beam of his flashlight dancing across the walls. The air was thick with moisture, each breath tasting of old stone and secrets long kept. The passage curved gently, and he followed it as it wound deeper into the earth, the music growing clearer with each step. At last, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The walls were rough stone, the floor littered with scraps of wood and stone that had been carved into crude religious figures. In the center of the room lay a thin mattress, and on it, a frail figure wrapped in tattered blankets. "Sister," Father Elias called softly, his voice cracking with emotion. The figure stirred, a low, ragged cough breaking the silence. Slowly she turned toward him, her face pale and gaunt, but her eyes bright with an unbroken light. "Elias," she whispered, her voice no more than a breath of sound. "Is it really you?" Tears spilled down his cheeks as he fell to his knees beside her, his hands reaching for hers with a trembling reverence. "It's me, Tess," he said, his voice choked with relief and wonder. "I've come for you." She smiled faintly, her lips cracked and dry, but her expression serene. "I knew you would," she said. God never left me, and neither did you. For a long moment, they sat in the darkness, the only light the beam of his flashlight and the glow of her faith. Father Elias pressed her frail hand to his lips, his tears mingling with the dirt and blood that stained her skin. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise you, you're safe." But even as he spoke the words, he knew the truth was more complicated. There were questions that demanded answers, shadows that still lingered in the corners of the darkness. He would face them all because for the first time in 28 years, he had found his sister, and nothing would keep him from bringing her into the light. Father Elias's heart was pounding in his chest as he knelt beside his sister, the reality of her frail form filling the small underground chamber with an almost suffocating weight. His mind reeled with questions, each one jostling for attention, but he forced himself to remain still, to focus on her. She needed comfort, not an interrogation. "Tess," he whispered again, brushing a matted lock of hair from her forehead. Her skin was cold and clammy, and the air in the tunnel seemed to press down around them. "How long have you been down here? Who did this to you?" Her eyes fluttered open, glistening in the dim light. "Years," she rasped. "So many years, Elias. I lost count." Her voice was barely audible, each word pulled from a place of exhaustion and pain. She coughed, the sound harsh in the small space, and he quickly reached into his pocket for the small bottle of water he always carried for emergencies. "Here, sip this," he urged, lifting the bottle to her lips. She drank greedily, the water trickling down her chin, and he saw a flicker of life return to her eyes. When she leaned back, he could see the effort it took her just to breathe. "You're safe now," he repeated, though the words tasted hollow on his tongue. He could feel the weight of the years between them, pressing in on every breath. "I'll get you out of here. I've already called the police. They're coming." She smiled faintly, a ghost of the expression he remembered from their childhood. "God sent you," she murmured. "I prayed. Every day, I prayed you would find me." Father Elias's throat tightened. "I prayed too, Tess. Every day." He glanced around the chamber, his gaze catching on the rough carvings lining the walls. Crosses, saints, verses from scripture etched into stone and wood. A testament to her faith, even in captivity. The sound of footsteps echoing from the tunnel drew his attention. Harold appeared, his weathered face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Father," he said quietly, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and horror. "The officers are on their way. They're bringing medics." Father Elias nodded, his hand still clasping his sister's. "Thank you, Harold," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Stay with me, please. She needs us both right now." Harold moved closer, his expression somber as he took in the scene. "Dear God," he murmured, his gaze lingering on the fragile figure on the mattress. "How could this have happened? Right under our noses all these years." Father Elias didn't have an answer. Instead, he focused on his sister, memorizing every detail of her face, the lines of suffering, and the glimmer of hope that still burned in her eyes. "Tell me about him, Tess," he said softly. "Who did this?" Her eyes darkened, a shadow passing over her expression. "Redwood," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. "Silas Redwood. He took us. He kept us down here." The name hit Father Elias like a blow. He had suspected Redwood's involvement, but to hear it confirmed by his sister's own lips filled him with a cold, righteous fury. "I promise you," he said, his voice a low growl, "he will never hurt you again." Tessa's eyes closed briefly, her breathing ragged. He's not the only one," she said. And Father Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning closer. "Who else?" She shook her head weakly. "There were others, men who came and went. I don't know their names. Redwood was the one. Always there, watching, controlling." Father Elias's hands clenched around hers. "I won't let them hide in the shadows any longer," he vowed. "You're coming home, and they will pay for what they did." The sound of voices echoed down the tunnel then, sharp, authoritative, edged with urgency. The police had arrived. Relief and apprehension warred within Father Elias as he stood, gently easing his sister's hand back onto the mattress. "Stay with me, Tess," he said. "I'll be right back." He stepped out into the tunnel, where Deputy Williams and Deputy Reynolds were making their way forward, their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Father," Williams called softly, We're here. We'll get her out safely. Father Elias nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it all. She's alive, he said simply. But she's weak. She needs help. William's expression softened. We'll get her the medical attention she needs, he promised, and we'll make sure Redwood answers for this. The officers moved past him, their voices low and calm as they approached the chamber. Father Elias turned to Harold, who stood silently beside him, his face drawn and pale. We have to believe she'll heal, Elias said quietly. Body and spirit. Harold nodded. She's strong, he said. Stronger than most. She survived this hell. She'll find her way back. As they watched the paramedics move in to tend to Sister Teresa, Father Elias felt a fierce, protective resolve surge within him. The battle was only beginning. There would be questions, investigations, and hard truths to face. But his sister was alive, and that was a miracle worth every struggle to come. He closed his eyes briefly, sending up a prayer of gratitude for her endurance, and a silent plea for the strength to help her reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. In the shadows of the tunnel, beneath the weight of years and secrets, Father Elias found a glimmer of light, and he knew he would follow it, wherever it led. Father Elias watched with bated breath as the paramedics gently lifted his sister's frail body onto a stretcher, their movements tender and deliberate, as if afraid she might shatter at the slightest touch. The flickering beam of the police flashlights cast eerie shadows across the walls of the underground chamber, illuminating the intricate carvings that bore testament to Sister Teresa's unwavering faith throughout her years of captivity. As the paramedics began the careful process of securing her for the journey out of the darkness, Father Elias stepped closer, his eyes never leaving his sister's face. "I'm here, Tess," he whispered, his voice catching on the weight of those three simple words. "I'm here, and I won't leave you." Sister Teresa's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile flickered across her lips. "I know," she breathed, the words a fragile promise wrapped in the dim air of the subterranean world. "I never stopped believing you would find me." The officers moved with swift precision, ensuring every step was measured and deliberate, as they prepared to escort the paramedics up the narrow, time-worn staircase that led back to the world above. The stale, cold air of the tunnel seemed to press down harder, but for Father Elias, the darkness felt less absolute now, as if the very act of finding his sister had begun to push back the shadows that had consumed this place for so long. "Father Elias," Deputy Williams said in a low voice, drawing his attention, "we'll have her in the ambulance soon. I'd like you to stay with us until she's safely at the hospital." Father Elias nodded, though a part of him ached to stay here, to memorize every inch of this hidden place that had stolen 28 years of his sister's life. "Of course," he said, his voice thick. "I'll go wherever she goes." As the paramedics began their careful ascent, Father Elias followed close behind. The weight of the years of grief and hope balanced delicately on his shoulders. He moved with the steady rhythm of prayer in his heart. Each step up the stone staircase, a silent litany of thanksgiving and resolve. When they emerged into the cool night air, the hush of the forest enveloped them like a benediction. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, pinpricks of light scattered across the indigo sky, a celestial tapestry that spoke of endurance and renewal. The paramedics moved quickly, easing Sister Teresa into the waiting ambulance, their faces set in professional concentration. Father Elias caught her gaze one last time before the doors closed, her eyes filled with both relief and the deep, abiding sorrow of one who had seen too much. "I'll be right behind you," he called softly. "I promise." As the ambulance pulled away, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness, Father Elias felt a profound stillness settle over him. He turned back to the scene, to the officers and investigators who lingered near the entrance to the underground chamber. Their faces were drawn with the grim satisfaction of a case finally cracked open, but also with the weight of the horror they had uncovered. Deputy Williams approached, his brow furrowed. "We've secured Redwood," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "He's in custody, and we'll be questioning him about everything we found down there." Father Elias nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "What about the others?" he asked, his voice low. "The other nuns who disappeared, do we know where they are?" Williams's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "We found skeletal remains," he admitted, his voice carefully measured. "We believe they belong to the two older nuns, Sister Mildred and Sister Joan. It's clear they didn't survive long after they were taken. The words hit Father Elias like a blow, and he closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath to steady the roiling storm in his chest. "May their souls rest in peace," he murmured, crossing himself. "And may justice finally be done." Harold stood silently at his side, his weathered face creased with lines of grief and anger. "How could this happen?" he asked softly. "How could someone hide something like this for so long?" Father Elias shook his head. "Evil festers in the dark, Harold," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "But light always finds a way to break through. We're seeing that now." As the police began to cordon off the area, securing evidence and preparing to excavate the hidden chambers beneath Redwood's property, Father Elias felt a fierce sense of purpose settle in his heart. He knew the days ahead would be filled with questions, some of them impossible to answer. But he also knew that every truth brought into the light was a victory over the shadows that had held sway for too long. As he and Harold made their way back to the car, the weight of the night pressed in around them, but it was no longer the suffocating darkness of loss and uncertainty. It was the darkness that comes before the dawn, the breathless hush that precedes the first break of light. In the distance, the glow of the hospital's lights beckoned, a symbol of hope and healing. Father Elias took a steadying breath, his hands clenched into fists of determination. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truth still waited to be uncovered, he would face them all, for his sister, for the memory of the women who had been lost, and for the quiet, enduring light of faith that had guided them all to this moment. As Father Elias and Harold drove away from Redwood's property, the weight of the night pressed in on them like the quiet before a storm. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the road was the only sound that filled the small car, each bump and jolt a grim reminder of the journey they had undertaken and the uncharted territory that lay ahead. Father Elias stared out the window, his mind a whirl of fragmented memories and stark images. The underground cell, the weathered grate, his sister's frail face illuminated by the harsh white light of a flashlight. "Harold," he said at last, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I can't help but wonder how she survived all those years in that place, how she kept her faith." Harold kept his eyes on the road, the lines of his face deepening in the dim glow of the dashboard. "I reckon it's what kept her going, Father," he said. "Faith's a hard thing to kill, even when everything else has been stripped away." Father Elias nodded slowly, his fingers brushing against the beads of his rosary where it lay coiled in his lap. He remembered the last words he had shared with his sister, her whispered assurance that God had never left her. It was a truth he clung to now, as the night deepened and the road ahead seemed endless. When they finally reached the hospital, the sterile light of the emergency entrance cut through the darkness like a blade, a promise of safety and care. They parked and walked briskly through the automatic doors, the scent of antiseptic and the low murmur of medical staff greeting them like a benediction. In the ICU waiting room, Father Elias was ushered to a small cluster of chairs by a nurse, her expression kind but guarded. "Please wait here, Father," she said softly. "The doctors are still working with your sister. She's stable, but very weak." He nodded, sinking into the chair as Harold settled beside him. The room was silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning and the muted footsteps of passing nurses. The quiet was a heavy thing, thick with the weight of unspoken questions and the restless echoes of the night. Father Elias closed his eyes, the images of the hidden tunnel and the underground cell playing across the backs of his eyelids like a silent film. The memory of the humming, the low, almost haunting sound of ancient prayers drifting up through the earth, echoed in his mind, a melody that refused to be silenced. "I keep thinking about that song," he murmured, his voice breaking the stillness. "The Salve Regina." It's as if her soul was singing even when her body was trapped. Harold nodded slowly. "It's a beautiful hymn," he said. "A prayer of hope. Maybe that's what she needed to hold on to." They sat in silence for a long time, the minutes stretching out like hours. When the nurse finally returned, her expression was gentle but resolute. "Father Elias," she said softly, "you can see her now, but only for a few minutes. She's very tired." He rose to his feet, his heart pounding. The nurse led him down a long, quiet hallway, the scent of disinfectant sharp in the air. At the end of the hall, she paused by a closed door and looked back at him. "She's been asking for you," she said, "but she's very weak. Please be gentle." Father Elias nodded, his throat tight. As he pushed open the door and stepped inside, the low beep of the monitors was the first sound that greeted him. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp near the bed. Sister Teresa lay beneath a thin blanket, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes bright with an inner light that had never been extinguished. "Tess," he whispered, stepping to her side and taking her hand in his. Her fingers were thin and cold, but they closed around his with surprising strength. "Elias," she murmured, her voice a fragile echo of the vibrant woman he remembered. "You found me." "I never stopped looking," he said, tears blurring his vision. "I never stopped praying." She managed a faint smile. "I know," she said. "I felt your prayers, even in the darkness. They kept me alive." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch gentle. "Tell me," he said softly, his voice shaking. "How did you survive, Tess? How did you hold on all these years?" Her eyes closed briefly, a shiver running through her frail body. "Faith," she whispered, "and the songs, the prayers, they were my light in the darkness." He nodded, his own faith renewed by her quiet conviction. "I'm here now," he said. "You're safe. We're going to bring you home." She squeezed his hand weakly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Home," she murmured. "Yes, home." The nurse touched his shoulder gently, signaling that his time was up. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to his sister's forehead, a silent vow that he would never let her go again. As he stepped back into the hallway, the weight of what he had seen and heard settled over him like a mantle. But beneath the grief and the horror, there was something else. A quiet certainty that light would always find a way through the darkness, and that the echoes of silence would one day give way to songs of freedom and faith. As Father Elias stepped away from his sister's bedside, a sense of both relief and dread settled over him, like a cloak woven from midnight and memory. The air in the hallway felt sharp, every breath cutting into the stillness, as he walked back to the waiting area, where Harold waited, his face grave and watchful. "How is she?" Harold asked softly, his voice a balm against the stark white silence of the hospital. She's alive," Father Elias whispered, his voice unsteady, his eyes shimmering with both tears and a quiet, radiant determination. "Her spirit, it's still there. After everything, it's still there." Harold nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile flickering across his weathered features. "A miracle," he said, "pure and simple." But Father Elias knew that the road ahead was anything but simple. As they sat together in the hospital's small chapel, a quiet sanctuary dimly lit by flickering candles, he closed his eyes and let the rhythm of prayer flow through him, the murmured words a steady drumbeat beneath the chaos of his thoughts. He thought of the air vent, the haunting music of the Salve Regina echoing from below, the long-forgotten stones of the chapel, buried beneath Redwood's immaculate landscaping, and he thought of Redwood himself, his cold defiance, his sneer as he was led away in handcuffs, the flicker of something twisted in his eyes that was more than mere arrogance. "Harold," Father Elias murmured, his voice low and almost lost in the hush of the chapel. "There's more to this, more than just what we found." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You mean the journal? The tunnels?" "All of it," Father Elias said. "There's a darkness there that goes deeper than stone and shadows. Redwood didn't just build a tomb, he built a fortress, a sanctuary for his own twisted beliefs." Harold frowned, his expression thoughtful. "The journal said he was obsessed with the church, with the nuns, that he saw them as, what, symbols of everything he hated?" "Yes," Father Elias said quietly. "He saw them as traitors to the natural order, women who refused their duty to family to him, and in that hatred, he built a prison for them, a place where he could rewrite the world in his own image." The words tasted bitter on his tongue, each syllable a wound that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He felt the weight of it, the weight of every whispered prayer that had gone unheard, every cry for help that had echoed in that subterranean darkness for decades. And he knew, with a certainty that burned through him like a blade of light, that he could not let this darkness remain buried. "We have to go back," he said, his voice a quiet vow. Harold looked at him in surprise. "Back to Redwood's property?" Father Elias nodded, his jaw set. "I need to see it again, to understand." to pray over that ground, to reclaim it for the light. Harold hesitated, but then he nodded too, a slow, solemn motion that carried with it the weight of shared resolve. "Then we'll go," he said simply. "When the police finish their work, we'll go." As they left the chapel and stepped back into the fluorescent glow of the hospital corridors, Father Elias felt the shadows pressing in around them. But he also felt something else, something stronger than fear or grief. A promise. A flicker of hope that glowed as steady as the candles they had just left behind. Because even in the deepest darkness, he knew the light would find a way. And when it did, it would burn away the shadows, leaving nothing but truth and grace in its wake. The next day dawned with a sharp, cold clarity, the kind of morning that seemed to strip away illusions and lay everything bare in the stark light of reality. Father Elias rose early, the memory of his sister's sunken eyes and quiet, steadfast faith still etched into his soul like an indelible mark. In the hush of his modest hotel room, he knelt once more in prayer, the words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum, each syllable an offering of both sorrow and gratitude. Outside, the world stirred to life with the usual rhythm of birdsong and distant traffic, a stark contrast to the heavy, resolute calm that filled his heart. By mid-morning, he met Harold in the hospital parking lot. Harold's face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes held the same steady determination that Father Elias felt mirrored in his own. "They're allowing us access to the property again," Harold said without preamble. "Deputy Williams says they've completed the initial search and secured the site. He'll meet us there shortly." Father Elias nodded, feeling a ripple of unease in his chest, but pushing it aside. "Then let's go," he said softly. The drive back to Redwood's estate felt different this time. No longer did it feel like trespassing or a forbidden act. Now it felt like a pilgrimage, an act of spiritual reclamation. The forest road was still and watchful, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. When they arrived, they found Deputy Williams waiting by the broken fence, his face grave. "Father, Harold," he greeted them. "We've done a thorough sweep. Redwood's journal confirms that he built that underground chamber himself, though he tried to make it look like it had always been there. He used it to hold the sisters, first as prisoners, then as some sort of dark shrine to his twisted beliefs." Father Elias swallowed hard. "And the other remains?" "Confirmed," Williams said quietly. "They've been taken for proper burial. We'll work with the diocese to ensure they're honored." "Thank you," Father Elias said, his voice tight with emotion. "May they finally rest in peace." Williams gestured to the gap in the fence. "You're free to go in. The area is secure. If you'd like privacy to pray, you'll have it." Father Elias inclined his head in gratitude and stepped through the gap in the fence, Harold at his side. The ornamental landscaping seemed even more incongruous now. The carefully pruned shrubs and manicured paths, a sterile facade over the horror that had unfolded here. They moved past the decorative pond, the delicate blossoms of ornamental cherry trees, until they reached the spot where the chapel had once stood. The ground was still raw in places, the earth turned over by police excavation. Father Elias felt the weight of every silent prayer that had been spoken here, every whispered cry for mercy that had gone unanswered for so long. He knelt, pressing his palms to the cold, damp soil. "Lord," he whispered, his voice a trembling echo of the prayers that had once filled this place, "this ground has been defiled by darkness. Let your light reclaim it." He closed his eyes and began to recite the prayers of exorcism and blessing, each word an invocation of divine grace to wash away the stain of Redwood's evil. Harold knelt beside him, adding his own quiet prayers to the litany, their voices weaving together like a fragile tapestry of hope and healing. In that moment, Father Elias felt the weight of all those lost years, the decades of suffering endured by his sister and her companions, the burden of questions that would never fully be answered. But he also felt something else, a warmth, subtle at first, then growing stronger, like a gentle breath of wind stirring the air around him. A promise that even here, even now, the divine presence was still at work, that in the end, light would always prevail over darkness. When the final prayers had been spoken, he rose slowly, his knees stiff and cold, but his spirit stronger than it had felt in years. He looked at Harold, who gave a small nod of understanding. "She's safe now," Harold said. "They're all safe, in the only way that truly matters." Father Elias smiled faintly, his heart swelling with both sorrow and relief. "Yes," he said softly. Father Elias spent the following days at the hospital, a quiet presence in the stark white hallways that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. Sister Teresa's condition was precarious, her body weakened by years of deprivation, but her spirit remained unbroken. Each time he entered her room, swathed in the sterile blue of a protective gown and mask, her eyes would light up with a flicker of that old, unwavering faith. "Elias," she would whisper, her voice still a mere breath, but carrying the weight of years. "Tell me again about the world outside." So he did. He told her of the seasons she had missed, of the parish children who had grown into young adults in the years she'd been lost, of the new stained glass at St. Agnes that caught the morning sun in dazzling colors. He told her of the prayers that had never ceased, the candles that had burned for her through endless nights. In those moments, it felt as if the darkness that had once surrounded her was slowly retreating, replaced by the light of all the love and hope that had endured in her absence. One evening, as he read softly from the book of Psalms by her bedside, she reached out and touched his hand. "I always knew you would come," she said, her fingers as light as a whisper. "In the darkness, I heard your prayers. They kept me alive." Tears burned in Father Elias's eyes, but he only smiled. "Your faith kept you alive, sister," he said gently. "And now you are safe." Outside the room, the world carried on with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the quiet miracle taking place within those walls. The nurses moved with professional efficiency, their voices hushed as they discussed treatment plans and medication schedules. The hospital chaplain stopped by once, offering prayers and a quiet blessing for Sister Teresa's continued recovery. Father Elias thanked him, though in his heart he felt a quiet certainty that the only prayer needed now was one of gratitude. Late that night, after Sister Teresa had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Father Elias stepped outside into the crisp night air. The stars shone cold and clear above the hospital parking lot, and for the first time in decades, he felt as if the weight of the past was finally beginning to lift. Harold joined him, leaning against the hood of his old truck. "She's strong," he said quietly, "stronger than anyone I've ever known." Father Elias nodded. Her faith sustained her in that darkness. It will sustain her now. They stood in silence for a long moment, the chill night air filled with the quiet music of distant crickets and the gentle rustle of pine needles. "Williams called earlier," Harold said eventually. "Redwood is in custody. They're building the case against him. There's talk of multiple life sentences, given the horror of it all." Father Elias closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer for the justice that was now being carried out, and for the souls of those who had not survived Redwood's madness. "The world will know," he said softly, "and perhaps it will learn." As he spoke, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him like a mantle. There would be trials still, questions to answer, wounds to heal, but in that moment, beneath the cold stars, he knew that the greatest trial had already been overcome. That light had returned to the place where darkness had once reigned. The following morning brought a fragile new light that spilled across the hospital courtyard like a promise of better days. Father Elias woke early, driven by the same quiet resolve that had carried him through the past weeks. He knelt in the small hospital chapel, the morning sun turning the stained glass windows into living mosaics of color. His prayers were no longer for rescue, but for healing, of body, of mind, of spirit, for his sister and for himself. When he returned to Sister Teresa's room, he found her awake and alert, a trace of color returning to her pale cheeks. Her frailty was still evident, her body a testament to the years of deprivation, but her eyes were clear and steady, the fire of her faith burning there as brightly as ever. "You look stronger today," he said gently, taking her hand in his. She managed a small smile. "I feel stronger," she whispered. "The doctors are amazed," he said. "They say your progress is remarkable." "It's God's will," she murmured. "His grace is sufficient." As they spoke, a nurse entered with a warm smile, checking Sister Teresa's vital signs and adjusting her IV. "You're a miracle," she said softly to the frail woman in the bed. "We don't often see such resilience." Sister Teresa only smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the small wooden cross she had carved from scraps of wood in that underground prison, a symbol of the faith that had sustained her through the darkness. Father Elias knew the road ahead would be long. There would be therapy to rebuild her strength, sessions with gentle-voiced counselors to help her process the years of captivity and loss. But he also knew she would face it all with the same unwavering faith that had seen her through those 28 years. The police investigation continued in the background, threads of truth and horror being carefully pieced together. Redwood remained in custody, his once imposing presence reduced to a sullen figure behind bars. In the days to come, Father Elias knew he would be called to testify, to recount the events that had led him to that hidden underground cell. He would stand in that courtroom, a witness to both the horror of Redwood's crimes and the miracle of his sister's survival. But for now, there was only this quiet moment in the hospital room, the soft beeping of machines, the faint rustle of sheets, the gentle murmur of nurses outside. Father Elias bowed his head, offering up a final prayer of thanks. "You are home now, Terrace," he said softly, "and no darkness will ever touch you again." She squeezed his hand gently, her smile a quiet echo of the girl she had once been, and the woman she had become. In that moment, Father Elias understood that some wounds never fully heal, but that faith and love could carry even the most broken of souls back into the light. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, he rose and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air that smelled of pine and promise. The sun rose steadily, washing the world in golden light. And for the first time in decades, Father Elias felt the weight of grief lift from his shoulders, replaced by the warm certainty of hope. The past would never be forgotten, but it would no longer hold them captive. The story of the missing nuns would be told, their memories honored, their faith an eternal testament to the power of light over darkness. And as Father Elias watched the sunrise, he knew that this was only the beginning, the dawn of a new chapter, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the quiet, unbreakable power of faith. As the final echoes of Gregorian chants fade into the stillness of the forest, we are left with a story that is both horrifying and awe-inspiring, a tale of loss, resilience, and the enduring light of faith in the face of absolute darkness. Sister Elias Maro's miraculous survival reminds us of the strength that lies within the human spirit and the unbreakable bonds of family and devotion. We invite you to share your thoughts on this powerful journey of faith and redemption. Leave a comment below, let us know what moved you most about this story, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping narratives that explore the depths of the human heart.